A cold wind moves along a high stone wall. Far below, darkness gathers in the folds of a mountain valley, and scattered torchlight trembles against ancient masonry that has endured centuries of storm and war. The sound is not yet battle, it is something quieter. The creak of leather, the murmur of weary voices, the distant cry of a night bird among the slopes of the White Mountains. Above it all hangs a sky filled with stars, indifferent and ancient, shining over a fortress that has witnessed the rise and fall of kings. You are settling in for the story of Helm's Deep, the siege that saved Rohan. It is a tale of stone and courage, of old legends returning to life, and of a kingdom standing on the edge of ruin. As you listen, let the sounds of the deeping coombe surround you. And if you have traveled these night roads before, quietly note which night of the journey this is for you. If you are just arriving, let this be night 1. Long before the armies of Saruman marched from Isengard, before Theoden King rode beneath a storm-dark sky, before Aragorn, son of Arathorn, stood upon the walls of the Hornburg, there was already something old waiting in that valley. Helm's Deep was not merely a fortress, it was a place where the memory of earlier ages lingered in stone. The mountains remembered, the caves remembered. Even the wind seemed to carry echoes from years that had passed beyond the reach of ordinary men. And that raises the first mystery of our journey. Why did a fortress originally built by Gondor become the place that would ultimately determine the survival of Rohan itself? To answer that question, you must travel backward through the history of Middle-earth, away from the War of the Ring and into centuries that many readers pass over quickly. The Hornburg did not appear suddenly when the Rohirrim needed shelter. Its foundations belonged to an older world. In the days when the power of Gondor stretched far beyond its later borders, the kings and stewards of the South Kingdom maintained a chain of fortifications across the western lands. Their realm was stronger then, its population was greater. Its reach extended deep into territories that would later belong to others. The valley known as the Deeping Coombe lies in the northwestern reaches of the White Mountains, called the Ered Nimrais in Sindarin. These mountains formed a vast barrier running across the southern regions of Middle-earth. Their snow-capped peaks watched over Gondor to the south and the lands that would become Rohan to the north. Deep within one fold of these mountains lay a narrow valley with steep sides and a defensible entrance. Any commander looking upon it would immediately recognize its value. An army could not easily surround it. A smaller force could hold it against larger numbers. Stone itself seemed to favor the defender. At some point during Gondor's long centuries of strength, a fortress arose there. Tolkien never provides a detailed account of its construction, and the exact date remains uncertain. Yet the books make clear that the Hornburg and the Deeping Wall were ancient even by the time of the War of the Ring. They belonged to an earlier age of engineering and military planning. Their builders were the Dunedain of Gondor, descendants of the Númenóreans, who had survived the downfall of Númenor at the end of the Second Age. Those descendants carried with them knowledge, skills, and traditions that often seemed remarkable to later generations. If you picture the fortress as it stood in the days of Theoden, you begin to understand why it inspired such confidence. The Hornburg itself rose upon a great rocky spur at the head of the valley. Thick walls climbed from living stone. A towering gate guarded the approach. In front stretched the Deeping Wall, a formidable defensive barrier running across the valley floor. Attackers could not simply march through open ground. They had to confront carefully designed defenses created by men who understood siege warfare. The wall possessed a detail that Tolkien mentions only briefly, but that reveals much about its builders. Through the Deeping Wall ran a culvert, a channel allowing the waters of the Deeping stream to pass beneath the fortifications. In peaceful times, it served a practical purpose. During war, it represented a potential weakness. Such details remind you that even the strongest fortress remains part of the living landscape around it. Water must flow. Supplies must move. No defense is completely perfect. The Rohirrim themselves were not the original masters of this place. Their ancestors came much later. In the year 2510 of the Third Age, the steward of Gondor, Eorl's ally Sirion, granted the province of Kalanardhan to the Eotheod. These horse lords migrated south and established the kingdom that became known as Rohan. From that point onward, the great grasslands north of the White Mountains belonged to the riders. Yet the older works of Gondor remained scattered throughout the land, silent reminders that another people had once guarded these frontiers. There is something quietly fascinating about that inheritance. The Rohirrim were famed for horses, speed, and open battle upon the plains. Their songs celebrated riders beneath the wind. Their kings measured strength in courage and loyalty. Yet when their darkest hour arrived, it was not an ancient hall of Rohan that preserved them. It was a fortress built by another people centuries before. History had left them an unexpected gift, one that neither Gondor's builders nor Rohan's founders could have fully anticipated. The valley held another secret as well, one hidden behind the Hornburg itself. Beyond the fortress lay the glittering caves, known in Sindarin as Aglarond. During the War of the Ring, these caverns would captivate Gimli, son of Glóin, so completely that he would speak of them with wonder unmatched by almost anything else he encountered. Yet their beauty remained largely unknown to the outside world before those events. Deep chambers stretched beneath the mountains. Stone gleamed in countless forms and colors. Water had shaped the caverns over ages beyond counting. When most people think of Helm's Deep, they picture battle. They remember ladders against walls, the clash of swords, and the thunder of cavalry at dawn. Yet the place itself existed long before that famous night. For centuries it watched kingdoms rise and fall. Seasons came and went across the White Mountains. Generations of Rohirrim lived and died. Kings rode out from Edoras and were buried beneath the grass-covered mounds beside the Snowborn. Still the fortress endured, patient and silent. And perhaps that is what makes the Hornburg feel so different from many other strongholds in Tolkien's world. Minas Tirith dominates a great city. Isengard revolves around the Tower of Orthanc. Rivendell flourishes with song and memory. Helm's Deep feels older, sterner, more elemental. It belongs to stone, mountain, and weather. Even before it became famous, it seemed to be waiting for a trial worthy of its strength. Yet another question lingers in the mountain air. If the fortress was already ancient when Theoden rode there in the year 3019 of the Third Age, why does the place bear the name of a king who lived only a few centuries earlier? Why is it called Helm's Deep at all? To answer that, you must leave the age of Theoden and journey into one of the bleakest winters Rohan ever endured, when a king named Helm Hammerhand stood against invaders, famine, and snow beneath the same cold stars that now shine over the silent walls. Why did the people of Rohan remember Helm Hammerhand with such awe that an ancient fortress eventually took his name, while generations of other kings faded into little more than names in long genealogies? The answer begins in the year 2754 of the Third Age, more than 2.5 centuries before the War of the Ring. Rohan was already an old kingdom by then, founded by Eorl the Young after the gift of Kalanardhan from Gondor. The line of kings descended unbroken through the house of Eorl. Helm Hammerhand sat upon the throne as the 9th king of that line, ruling from Meduseld in Edoras. The realm appeared stable from a distance. Yet beneath that calm surface, tensions were growing that would soon erupt into one of the greatest crises in Rohirric history. At the center of the coming storm stood a man named Freyja. Tolkien describes him as a wealthy and powerful lord who possessed extensive lands on the borders between Rohan and Dunland. His ancestry itself reflected a point of unease. Freyja claimed descent from King Freyawiin of Rohan, but he also carried substantial Dunlendish blood through his father. The Rohirrim and the Dunlendings had a long history of distrust. Old disputes over land, language, and identity stretched back for generations. What began as a question of ancestry would soon become a question of power. Freyja came to Edoras with a proposal that was not truly a proposal at all. He desired that his son Wulf should marry Helm's daughter. Such a marriage would strengthen Freyja's position enormously. It would place his family close to the royal succession and elevate his influence throughout the Mark. Yet Helm immediately recognized something dangerous beneath the request. Freyja was not behaving like a loyal subject seeking favor. He was behaving like a man testing the strength of his king. Tolkien preserves a striking moment from that encounter. During their dispute, Helm accused Freyja of growing fat through wealth and arrogance. The quarrel escalated until Freyja threatened the king openly. Helm's response became one of the most famous episodes in the history of Rohan. He struck Freyja with a single blow of his fist. The impact killed him instantly. From that day forward, Helm earned the name Hammerhand. It was not a title granted by poets long afterward. It was a name born from a moment of explosive force before witnesses. Yet the death of Freyja solved nothing. If anything, it accelerated the danger. His son Wulf fled and found support among the Dunlendings, many of whom already resented Rohirric rule over lands they believed had once belonged to their own people. Grievances that had simmered for decades began to gather into something larger. While Helm remained king in Edoras, enemies were quietly preparing for war beyond his borders. Then came one of the harshest periods in the recorded history of northwestern Middle-earth. In the year 2758, disaster arrived from multiple directions at once. A great invasion struck Rohan. Wulf and his allies swept into the kingdom. At nearly the same time, corsairs from Umbar attacked Gondor to the south. Communication between the two realms became difficult. The ancient alliance that had protected both kingdoms for centuries suddenly found itself strained by crises on several fronts. Wulf's offensive succeeded with alarming speed. Edoras fell into enemy hands. The Golden Hall of Meduseld was occupied. Much of Rohan lay under hostile control. The royal family scattered. Helm's nephew Freyolaf fled into the mountain valleys, where resistance could continue. The kingdom that had seemed secure only months earlier now faced the possibility of complete destruction. For the first time since the founding of the Mark, the House of Yorl appeared genuinely threatened. Where could Helm retreat when the heart of his kingdom had fallen? The answer led him westward, toward the old Gondorian fortress in the Deeping Coombe. There, beneath the shadow of the White Mountains, he gathered what remained of his followers. The Hornburg became a refuge, not only for soldiers, but for ordinary people fleeing the invasion. Families arrived with whatever possessions they could carry. Livestock crowded the valleys. Supplies were gathered anxiously as winter approached. The fortress built centuries earlier for defense now faced a trial unlike any in its history. And then the weather turned against everyone. The years 2758 and 2759 became known throughout the north as the Long Winter. Tolkien mentions this catastrophe in several places, and its effects reached far beyond Rohan alone. Snow fell across vast regions of Middle-earth, rivers froze, travel became nearly impossible, food shortages spread. In the Shire, the Long Winter remained part of Hobbit memory for generations. Wolves crossed frozen lands in search of prey, Entire communities struggled simply to survive until spring. For those trapped within Helm's Deep, the situation became desperate. Enemy armies remained nearby. The cold intensified. Supplies dwindled. Hunger began its slow and merciless work. A fortress can resist swords and arrows. It cannot easily resist starvation. Every passing week tightened the pressure upon those sheltering behind the walls. The enemy hoped that winter itself would achieve what battle could not. And this is where Helm Hammerhand began to pass from history into legend. The stories preserved by the Rohirrim tell of the king leaving the Hornburg alone during the night. Clad in white from frost and snow, he would stalk through the darkness and attack enemy camps with his bare hands. The accounts describe him striking fear into the hearts of his foes. Men whispered that no weapon could kill him. Others claimed that he moved like a spirit among the drifts. As always with legends, it is difficult to separate literal fact from the awe of later storytellers. Yet the core truth remains clear. Helm continued fighting when many would have surrendered. What makes these tales so compelling is not merely their drama. They reveal something essential about Rohirric culture. The riders valued courage above comfort. They admired kings who shared danger rather than avoiding it. Helm did not remain hidden behind walls while others suffered. Whether every detail of the stories is exact matters less than the fact that his people believed them. In their memory, Helm became the embodiment of endurance against overwhelming odds. The winter dragged on. Hunger deepened. Death visited both besiegers and defenders. Yet the invaders faced their own hardships. Snow does not distinguish between armies. The same cold that tormented those within the Hornburg also weakened those outside it. Supply lines became unreliable. Morale deteriorated. The land itself seemed to turn hostile toward everyone who walked upon it. Then came the end. When spring finally arrived in 2759, Helm Hammerhand was found dead. Tolkien's account is brief but unforgettable. The king had perished while standing upright. His body remained frozen, still erect, as though he continued watching over the fortress even in death. There is no suggestion of defeat in the image. It feels instead like the final expression of a man who refused to yield. The Rohirrim would never forget it. Yet Helm himself did not live to see victory. That honor belonged to another member of the royal house. Freyalaf, son of Hild, gathered loyal forces and launched a counterattack. He retook Edoras. Wulf was slain. The invaders were driven out. The kingdom survived. The House of Yorl endured. And the fortress where Helm had made his final stand, forever afterward, became known as Helm's Deep. But another mystery remains. If Helm's Deep had already saved Rohan once during the long winter, why would the kingdom find itself again on the brink of destruction only 2.5 centuries later? To answer that question, we must turn toward Isengard, where a wizard once trusted by all the free peoples was slowly becoming something far more dangerous. How did Rohan, a kingdom that had survived the long winter, the invasion of Wulf, and centuries of warfare along its borders, become so vulnerable that it would once again retreat behind the walls of Helm's Deep? The answer begins not in Rohan itself, but in a dark tower standing at the southern end of the Misty Mountains. Orthanc rose from the ring of Isengard like a black spear of stone. It was ancient even by the standards of Gondor, crafted by the Númenóreans during the years of their power. Unlike ordinary fortresses, Orthanc possessed walls and surfaces so hard that no blade could scratch them. For many generations, Isengard served as a stronghold of Gondor, guarding the gap of Rohan and the western approaches to the White Mountains. Yet by the end of the Third Age, the fortress belonged to a different master. That master was Saruman the White. When Saruman first entered the histories of Middle-earth, he stood among its greatest defenders. He was not a mortal man, but one of the Astari, a Maya spirit sent from the west. Like Gandalf, he arrived in Middle-earth to assist the free peoples in their struggle against Sauron. He became head of the White Council. Elves respected his wisdom. Men valued his knowledge. Even among the Astari, Saruman held the highest rank. If anyone seemed destined to resist the shadow successfully, it was he. Yet Tolkien's works repeatedly return to a dangerous truth. Wisdom does not make a person immune to pride. Indeed, great wisdom can sometimes provide pride with more subtle tools. Saruman spent long years studying the arts of Sauron. He investigated the history of the Rings of Power. He searched ancient records concerning the One Ring. At first, these efforts served the common cause. Over time, however, admiration began to replace caution. Saruman convinced himself that he could master the knowledge that had corrupted others. He believed he could use power without becoming its servant. The tragedy is familiar throughout Tolkien's legendarium. Feanor, Ar-Pharazôn, and even Melkor himself followed similar paths. Each believed he could control forces that ultimately controlled him instead. One revealing detail appears in The Lord of the Rings. Saruman became fascinated with ring lore to such a degree that he secretly forged a ring of his own. During his confrontation with Gandalf at Orthanc, he calls himself Saruman Ringmaker. The ring he created possessed nothing like the power of the One Ring, yet the act itself reveals how far he had drifted. He was no longer merely studying the methods of Sauron. He was imitating them. While these changes unfolded within Orthanc, the kingdom of Rohan remained largely unaware of the danger growing nearby. Generations of Rohirrim had lived alongside Isengard. The fortress stood at the southern entrance of the Gap of Rohan, a strategic corridor between the Misty Mountains and the White Mountains. Whoever controlled that gap possessed enormous military advantages. Yet for many years, Saruman appeared to be an ally. His reputation as a wise wizard concealed his ambitions. Then another factor entered the story: the Dunlendings. The people of Dunland lived west of Rohan and south of the Misty Mountains. Their relationship with the Rohirrim had been troubled for centuries. They remembered lands lost when the Eotheod settled Calenardon. Old resentments survived from generation to generation. Saruman understood how to exploit those feelings. He offered leadership, promises, and a common enemy. By doing so, he gained thousands of willing followers long before open war began. At the same time, Isengard itself was changing. The green spaces within the ring gradually disappeared. Trees were cut down. Furnaces multiplied. Workshops expanded. Smoke rose into the sky. Tolkien presents these transformations with particular emphasis because they reflect one of his recurring concerns: the destruction of the natural world by ruthless industrial power. Where Gandalf appreciated growing things, Saruman increasingly valued production, efficiency, and domination. The changes did not stop with machinery. Among Saruman's most dangerous creations were the Uruk-hai. Orcs had existed since the Elder Days, serving first Morgoth and later Sauron. The Uruk-hai represented something different. Tolkien never provides a complete biological explanation for their origins, and speculation has persisted among readers for decades. What the published text makes clear is that Saruman bred a stronger strain of orc, one capable of enduring sunlight more effectively than many ordinary orcs. They were larger, tougher, and disciplined in ways unusual among their kind. When they marched beneath the white hand of Isengard, they became one of the most formidable military forces in northwestern Middle-earth. As Saruman's strength increased, Rohan's internal stability weakened. The key figure in this process was Grima Wormtongue. Grima served in the court of King Theoden. Outwardly, he appeared a loyal counselor. In reality, he acted as Saruman's agent. Through careful manipulation, half-truths, and constant discouragement, he gradually undermined the confidence of the king. The process unfolded slowly, rather than dramatically. That detail is important. Tolkien does not portray Theoden as suddenly enchanted by obvious magic. Instead, he shows how isolation, grief, age, and bad counsel can erode even a capable ruler's judgment over time. When readers first encounter Theoden in the Two Towers, the transformation is striking. He sits in Meduseld looking older than his years. His vitality seems diminished. His authority has weakened. Decisions that once came naturally now require persuasion. Meanwhile, Grima stands nearby, shaping information before it reaches the king. It is a political corruption as much as a spiritual one. Why was Theoden particularly vulnerable at this moment? Part of the answer lies in personal loss. His wife Elfhild had died years earlier. More recently, Rohan faced increasing threats along its borders. The burden of kingship grew heavier. Most importantly, Theoden's son and heir, Theodred, carried much of the kingdom's military responsibility. Theodred was widely respected. He understood the danger posed by Saruman earlier than many others. He spent considerable effort defending the western frontier, especially the crossings of the river Isen. This brings us to the battles that directly prepared the way for Helm's Deep. In February and March of the year 3019, Saruman launched major offensives against Rohan. The river Isen formed a natural defensive line. At the fords of Isen, Rohirrim forces attempted to block enemy advances. The fighting was fierce and costly. During the first battle of the fords of Isen, Rohan suffered significant losses. The situation deteriorated further during the second battle of the fords of Isen on March 2nd, 3019. There, Theodred met his end. The exact details come primarily from unfinished tales, where Tolkien provides a fuller account than appears in The Lord of the Rings. Theodred fought bravely while attempting to defend the crossing. He was mortally wounded during the struggle. His death removed one of Rohan's strongest military leaders at precisely the moment the kingdom needed him most. The loss struck both strategically and emotionally. A kingdom already under pressure suddenly lost its heir. And here, a haunting question emerges. If Theodred had survived, would the story of Helm's Deep have unfolded differently? No text provides a definitive answer. Yet the question lingers because Theodred had consistently recognized Saruman's threat. He advocated stronger action against Isengard. He commanded respect among the riders. His survival would not have eliminated Saruman's army, but it might have altered how Rohan responded during those critical days. Tolkien leaves the possibility hanging in silence. By early March of 3019, the situation had become dire. Saruman's armies were advancing. Theodred was dead. The western defenses were collapsing. Grima still poisoned the atmosphere of the royal court. Across the Mark, uncertainty spread like a gathering storm. The kingdom that had once thundered across open plains now faced enemies on multiple fronts. Yet at that very moment, another traveler was riding toward Edoras. He had escaped imprisonment in Orthanc. He carried news of terrible urgency, and with him came the possibility that Rohan might still awaken before it was too late. His name, of course, was Gandalf the Grey. Why did Theoden choose to retreat to Helm's Deep instead of gathering every rider he could find and meeting Saruman's army upon the open plains that had always favored the Rohirrim? At first glance, the decision seems to contradict everything the riders of Rohan represented. Their strength lay in movement, speed, and cavalry warfare. For nearly 5 centuries, the Horse Lords had built their military identity around open country. They excelled when they could charge across rolling grasslands beneath a wide sky. Helm's Deep, by contrast, was a place of stone walls, narrow approaches, and defensive endurance. Yet by the time Theoden made his choice in March of 3019, circumstances had become far more complicated than a simple preference between attack and defense. The turning point came in the Golden Hall of Meduseld. When Gandalf arrived in Edoras alongside Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, he found a court that had fallen into stagnation. Theoden sat beneath the golden roof of Meduseld, while Grima Wormtongue stood close at hand. The king's authority remained intact in name, yet something vital had been diminished. Tolkien presents the scene as both political and spiritual. Gandalf did not merely provide military advice, he challenged the paralysis that had settled over the kingdom. The old king, long burdened by grief and manipulation, was called back to himself. The transformation remains one of the most memorable moments in The Two Towers. Theoden rises from his seat. Strength returns to his voice, his eyes clear. The weariness that had weighed upon him begins to lift. Tolkien deliberately avoids presenting this as simple magic. Gandalf's presence matters, certainly, but so does Theoden's own choice. The king accepts the truth that has been hidden from him and resolves to act. In that moment, Rohan awakens alongside its ruler. Grima's fall followed immediately. When Wormtongue's deceptions were exposed, Theoden offered him a final chance to prove his loyalty. It is a revealing act of mercy. Even after everything, the king did not immediately condemn him. Grima rejected the offer. Instead, he departed toward Isengard, carrying his bitterness with him. Theoden had regained his throne, but the damage inflicted upon the kingdom could not be undone in a single day. Armies were already moving. Battles were already being fought. Time had become the most precious resource of all. One of the first actions Theoden took was to ride west. His goal was not initially Helm's Deep. The king sought to gather strength and confront the crisis developing near the River Isen. News from the frontier continued to arrive. The death of Theodred hung heavily over every decision. The western regions of Rohan had suffered greatly. Villages had been destroyed. Refugees were on the move. Saruman's forces were advancing through territories that had once seemed secure. Theoden needed to understand the situation firsthand. As he rode from Edoras, he was accompanied by some of the most important figures in the War of the Ring. Aragorn, heir of Isildur, traveled beside him. Legolas Greenleaf of the Woodland Realm came as representative of the elves. Gimli, son of Glóin, represented the dwarves. Together with Gandalf, they formed an extraordinary company moving through the heart of a kingdom under threat. Yet even among such companions, it was Theoden's choices that would determine Rohan's immediate future. The king's journey brought him to Dunharrow, and then onward through the troubled western lands. Along the way, he encountered survivors fleeing eastward. The scale of the crisis became increasingly clear. These were not isolated raids. Entire communities had been uprooted. Families carried what possessions they could save. Livestock wandered alongside exhausted refugees. The war was no longer a distant threat discussed in council halls. It had arrived at the homes of ordinary people. And here another question emerges. What responsibility does a king bear when he knows he cannot protect every part of his realm at once? For Theoden, the answer centered on preserving both his people and the core of his military strength. If he divided his forces too widely, Saruman could destroy them piecemeal. If he attempted to defend every settlement, he risked losing everything. The harsh mathematics of war left few pleasant options. Rohan needed a place where civilians could gather and where soldiers could hold against superior numbers. Once again, the ancient fortress in the Deeping Coombe began to draw the attention of history. Meanwhile, Gandalf departed. His departure often surprises readers encountering the story for the first time. Just as the crisis deepens, the wizard rides away. Yet Gandalf's decision reflects his broader understanding of the conflict. He recognized that the struggle against Saruman could not be won solely by the forces already accompanying Theoden. Reinforcements would be needed. Information would be needed. Other pieces of a larger strategy were already moving across the board. Before leaving, Gandalf promised to return. The promise carried weight because Gandalf rarely spoke carelessly. In Tolkien's world, words matter. Oaths matter. Promises matter. When Gandalf tells Theoden to look for him at a specific time, the statement becomes more than reassurance. It becomes a thread of hope woven into an increasingly dark situation. Yet no one present could know whether the wizard would truly arrive in time. The uncertainty remained. As Theoden continued westward, reports concerning Saruman's army grew more alarming. Thousands of enemies were marching from Isengard. Uruk-hai formed the backbone of the force. Dunlendings accompanied them in large numbers. Orcs of various kinds swelled the ranks. The army advancing through the Gap of Rohan was not a raiding party or a border expedition. It was a deliberate attempt to break the kingdom's resistance in a single campaign. At this stage, some readers remember the version presented in Peter Jackson's film adaptation, where a large force of elves arrives to defend Helm's Deep. The image is powerful and memorable, yet it belongs to the adaptation rather than Tolkien's text. In the books, no army of elves marches from Lorien or Rivendell to reinforce the Hornburg. The burden of defense falls primarily upon the Rohirrim themselves, aided by a small number of extraordinary companions, and later by reinforcements gathered from within Rohan. That distinction matters because it highlights one of Tolkien's central themes. The Age of Men is arriving. The elves remain important, but they are no longer the dominant defenders of Middle-earth. Rohan must largely save itself. As Theoden weighed his options, the practical advantages of Helm's Deep became impossible to ignore. The fortress could shelter civilians. Its walls could compensate for numerical inferiority. The narrow valley would limit the effectiveness of enemy numbers. Most importantly, the Hornburg offered a chance to survive long enough for events elsewhere to unfold. A battle lost in the open field might destroy Rohan completely. A battle fought behind strong walls might preserve it. There is also a deeper historical layer to the decision. Whether consciously or unconsciously, Theoden was following the path once taken by Helm Hammerhand. The ancient king had faced invasion and overwhelming pressure. He had retreated to the same fortress. He had endured where others expected collapse. The memory of that earlier struggle remained embedded in Rohirric culture. Every writer knew the stories. Every lord knew the name. The valley carried the weight of precedent. By the evening of March 3rd, 3019, the king's course had become clear. The people of the Westfold were directed toward the Deeping Coombe. Soldiers assembled along the approaches. Refugees crowded the roads leading into the mountains. The weather itself seemed uneasy, with wind sweeping down from the heights of the White Mountains. Far away, Saruman's army continued its relentless advance. And as darkness gathered over the valleys of Rohan, the defenders began arriving at the fortress that had already saved the kingdom once before. Soon they would stand upon the Deeping Wall and look out into the night, wondering whether any wall, however ancient, could truly withstand what was coming toward them. Who exactly stood upon the walls of Helm's Deep on the eve of the siege, and how could such a force hope to resist one of the greatest armies assembled during the War of the Ring? The answer begins with a common misunderstanding. Because the Battle of the Hornburg became so famous, many people imagine a vast army gathered behind its walls. Tolkien's text paints a different picture. Theoden brought with him the strength he could assemble on short notice, but Rohan was already wounded by war. Many warriors had fallen at the fords of Isen. Others were scattered across the kingdom. Entire regions were struggling simply to survive the invasion. The defenders of Helm's Deep were brave, but they were not numerous enough to feel secure. The fortress itself became crowded long before the battle began. Refugees poured into the Deeping Combe from the Westfold. Farmers, shepherds, craftsmen, women, children, and the elderly sought safety behind the ancient walls. Wagons creaked along mountain roads. Animals were driven toward shelter. Families carried whatever possessions they could save from homes that might never be seen again. For these ordinary people, the battle was not an abstract military event. It was a desperate struggle for survival. One detail Tolkien emphasizes is the age of many defenders. When Aragorn looked upon those preparing for battle, he observed that numerous men were old. Others were very young. Rohan had been forced to gather every available fighter. The kingdom could not rely solely on seasoned veterans. Some standing upon the Deeping Wall had likely spent much of their lives tending horses, repairing fences, or working fields, rather than fighting major campaigns. Yet necessity often reshapes ordinary lives into extraordinary ones. Among these defenders stood King Theoden himself. This fact should not be overlooked. The king did not remain hidden in a secure chamber while others risked their lives. Like Helm Hammerhand before him, he shared the danger of those he led. Theoden's presence mattered greatly because morale forms an invisible part of every battle. Men fight differently when they see their king beside them. Fear remains, but it is accompanied by pride, loyalty, and determination. Throughout Tolkien's works, leadership repeatedly proves as important as weapons. Aragorn also took his place among the defenders. At this point in the story, Aragorn had not yet claimed the throne of Gondor. He remained a ranger, an exile, and an heir waiting for the right moment. Yet his experience exceeded that of nearly everyone around him. He had traveled widely across Middle-earth. He had fought orcs, served in distant wars, and learned from elves and Dunedain alike. In many ways, he represented the surviving wisdom of older ages. The Rohirrim may not have fully understood who he was, but they recognized his courage. Beside him stood Legolas Greenleaf and Gimli son of Glóin. Their presence carries symbolic weight beyond their individual abilities. For much of the history of Middle-earth, relations between elves and dwarves had been strained. Ancient grievances stretched back to the First Age and the tragedy of Doriath. Yet here, at Helm's Deep, an elf and a dwarf prepared to fight side by side. Their friendship had grown during the journey of the Fellowship. In the shadow of war, old divisions mattered less than common purpose. Tolkien quietly presents their companionship as one small victory against the darkness. As the defenders settled into their positions, another question naturally arose. How large was the army approaching them? The exact numbers in Tolkien's text are not always precise. Medieval-style chroniclers rarely provide modern military accounting. However, the army of Isengard clearly outnumbered the defenders by a substantial margin. Thousands of Uruk-hai marched beneath the White Hand. Dunlendings accompanied them in great numbers. Various orcs filled the ranks. The advancing host represented years of preparation within Isengard. Saruman intended not merely to raid Rohan, but to crush its ability to resist. Night drew closer as the enemy approached. Torches appeared in the distance. Scouts brought reports. The sounds of movement carried through the valleys. Somewhere beyond the darkness, thousands of boots struck earth in steady rhythm. The White Mountains loomed overhead, their peaks invisible against the night sky. Wind moved along the walls and through the mountain passes. Every defender knew that battle was coming. The only uncertainty concerned how long they could endure once it began. The geography of Helm's Deep now became critically important. The Deeping Combe functioned almost like a funnel. Enemy forces entering the valley could not deploy with complete freedom. Steep slopes confined movement. The Deeping Wall stretched across the entrance. Behind it stood the Hornburg itself. built upon elevated ground. Even if attackers breached one defensive position, others remained behind it. The fortress had been designed to force invaders into a series of increasingly difficult assaults. Yet strong walls alone do not guarantee victory. Throughout the history of Middle-earth, great fortresses had fallen before determined enemies. Gondolin fell during the First Age, despite hidden defenses. Minas Ithil was captured by the Nazgul. Even mighty Minas Tirith would later come perilously close to disaster. Stone delays defeat. It does not automatically prevent it. The defenders at Helm's Deep understood this reality. Every advantage purchased time, but time alone would not save them. As darkness deepened, smaller moments unfolded across the fortress. Men checked weapons. Archers inspected bowstrings. Horses were fed and secured. Messengers carried instructions from one position to another. Some warriors spoke quietly with friends. Others sat in silence. Tolkien rarely dwells on these intimate details, yet they fit naturally within the world he created. Before every great battle come ordinary human moments. Someone thinks of home. Someone remembers family. Someone wonders whether dawn will ever arrive. One of the most famous exchanges of the siege occurred between Legolas and Gimli. In both book and film, their friendly rivalry emerges during the battle, though the adaptation expands it considerably. Tolkien's version is subtler. Their growing friendship remains central, and their willingness to stand together amid overwhelming danger reflects one of the story's deeper themes. Evil thrives on division. Friendship undermines it. The idea appears repeatedly throughout The Lord of the Rings, whether among hobbits, men, elves, or dwarves. And still the numbers remained daunting. The defenders could see torchlight multiplying across the darkness. Enemy ranks stretched beyond easy counting. The white hand of Saruman appeared on shields and banners. Drums echoed through the valley. The sheer scale of the approaching force must have been difficult to comprehend. Every calculation suggested that the defenders should eventually be overwhelmed. Every practical assessment favored Isengard. Which brings us to one of the most intriguing mysteries of the entire battle. Did Saruman actually expect Helm's Deep to resist as long as it did? The wizard had studied warfare for decades. He knew the strength of his army. He understood the condition of Rohan. Perhaps he believed the fortress would collapse quickly beneath concentrated assault. Perhaps he underestimated the determination of Theoden and his followers. Or perhaps pride had already begun clouding his judgment, just as it had clouded so many other powerful figures throughout Tolkien's history. Whatever Saruman expected, the reality would soon surprise him. For as the last light faded from the western sky and darkness settled fully over the Deeping Coombe, the first ranks of Isengard reached the ancient wall. Thousands of eyes looked upward toward the defenders. Thousands more peered downward from stone battlements into a sea of enemies. Between them lay only a short stretch of ground, and beyond that narrow distance waited one of the most famous knights in the history of Middle-earth. How close did Helm's Deep actually come to falling during the night of March 3rd and 4th, 3019? And why do some readers underestimate just how desperate the situation became? The battle began beneath darkness and rain. Tolkien describes a storm breaking over the Deeping Coombe as Saruman's army advanced. Wind swept through the valley, water ran down stone walls and pooled beneath the feet of marching soldiers. Torches flickered in the wet air. Above them rose the ancient defenses of the Deeping Wall and the Hornburg. What had once been a quiet mountain refuge became a place of shouting voices, ringing steel, and relentless pressure. The attackers wasted little time. Uruk-hai surged toward the Deeping Wall, carrying ladders and siege equipment. Archers exchanged volleys across the darkness. Defenders hurled missiles downward from elevated positions. The narrow terrain worked in favor of Rohan, exactly as the builders of the fortress had intended. Enemy numbers could not be brought to bear all at once. Yet Saruman possessed enough troops to replace losses continuously. Every orc or Dunlending who fell could be followed by another. One of Tolkien's strengths as a storyteller lies in his ability to convey scale without relying heavily on numerical detail. You never receive a modern battlefield map. Instead, you experience the mounting pressure through events. Ladders appear against the wall. New waves arrive. Fighting spreads from one section of the defense to another. Gradually, the listener understands that the defenders are being tested everywhere at once. Among those defenders moved Aragorn. Throughout the battle, he appears repeatedly where danger is greatest. He fought upon the walls, encouraged weary soldiers, and coordinated resistance as conditions changed. His actions reflect a pattern, visible throughout The Lord of the Rings. Aragorn does not merely command from a distance. Like Theoden, he leads through personal example. The men around him can see him facing the same risks they face. In moments of crisis, that example becomes a force multiplier all its own. Legolas and Gimli likewise played notable roles during the fighting. Legolas used the remarkable skill of the elves with bow and arrow, striking enemies at considerable distances, even amid darkness and confusion. Gimli fought wherever close combat became necessary. Tolkien presents them as warriors of exceptional ability, yet he never allows their accomplishments to overshadow the larger struggle. No individual hero, however skilled, could win this battle alone. The survival of Helm's Deep depended upon the collective endurance of hundreds of defenders spread across multiple positions. As the hours passed, a troubling reality emerged. The attackers were making progress. The Deeping Wall remained standing, but sections of it came under increasing pressure. Uruk-hai succeeded in reaching the battlements. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted along portions of the wall. Defenders, who had begun the night-firing arrows, found themselves forced into brutal close combat. Every gain required the attackers to pay heavily in blood, yet they continued advancing. Saruman's army had been prepared for exactly this kind of assault. And here, we encounter one of the most intriguing mysteries surrounding the battle. What exactly was the blasting fire that breached the Deeping Wall? Tolkien's text provides only limited information. He describes a powerful explosive force employed by Saruman's servants at the culvert beneath the wall. A deafening detonation followed. Stone shattered. A breach opened where none had existed moments earlier. The event stands out because such technology appears rarely in Middle-earth. Ordinary siege engines are common. This was something different. Many readers immediately think of gunpowder. The comparison is understandable. The explosion behaves in ways that resemble early explosive compounds. Yet Tolkien never explicitly identifies it as gunpowder. Saruman's knowledge was extensive, drawing upon centuries of study and experimentation. The wizard combined craft, industry, and practical ingenuity in ways few others attempted. Whatever precise substance was employed, it represented another example of his willingness to use increasingly destructive methods in pursuit of domination. The symbolism is difficult to miss. Throughout the legendarium, evil often seeks shortcuts to power. Saruman does not trust patience, stewardship, or natural growth. He prefers mechanisms that achieve results quickly, even when they leave devastation behind. The explosion at the Deeping Wall reflects that mindset perfectly. An ancient defense built through labor and craftsmanship is torn apart in an instant by an artificial force designed solely to destroy. The breach transformed the battle. Enemy troops poured through the opening. Positions that had seemed secure suddenly became vulnerable. The defenders could no longer concentrate solely on holding the top of the wall. They now faced attacks from multiple directions. Fighting spread deeper into the fortress complex. Every minute became more costly. Every withdrawal surrendered valuable ground. Theoden watched these developments unfold with increasing concern. The king remained active throughout the night, moving where needed and encouraging resistance. Yet even courage has limits when confronted by mathematics. The defenders were being compressed steadily backward. They had begun the battle holding the outer defenses. Now they were gradually abandoning sections of those defenses to preserve their remaining strength. The logic of siege warfare was taking hold. Space was being exchanged for survival. One particularly important location became the focus of fierce fighting: the causeway leading toward the Hornburg itself. This elevated approach represented one of the final routes into the heart of the fortress. If attackers secured it completely, the pressure upon the remaining defenders would become immense. Again and again, combat surged around this area. Men of Rohan fought beside Aragorn and others to prevent a complete collapse. Casualties mounted, exhaustion spread. The night seemed endless, and still the rain continued. There is something haunting about Tolkien's description of weather during major battles. Rain falls at Helm's Deep. Dust and smoke later shroud Pelennor fields. Nature never entirely withdraws from these events. Water ran over armor. Mud formed beneath thousands of feet. Torches hissed and sputtered. Beneath all the noise of battle, the storm persisted with calm indifference. As midnight passed and the hours crept toward dawn, the defenders found themselves in a grim position. The deeping wall had been breached. Enemy troops occupied portions of ground once held securely by Rohan. The Hornburg itself remained unconquered, but the space available to its defenders had narrowed considerably. Many warriors had been fighting continuously for hours. Reinforcements had not arrived. Gandalf was nowhere to be seen. Saruman's army still possessed substantial strength. This is the point where some later retellings simplify the story into a heroic last stand that was always destined to succeed. Tolkien's version feels very different. Victory is not guaranteed. Indeed, defeat appears increasingly plausible. The defenders do not know they are characters in a famous tale. They know only what they can see around them: exhausted comrades, advancing enemies, and darkness that refuses to end. Which raises another question. Why did Theoden and Aragorn choose to keep fighting when surrender might have spared some lives? The answer lies partly in practical reality. Saruman had shown little reason to trust his mercy. More importantly, surrender would not necessarily save the people sheltering behind the fortress. Rohan itself remained at stake. If resistance ended here, the kingdom's remaining organized defense could collapse entirely. The men fighting in the Hornburg understood that they were protecting more than stone walls. They were protecting everyone gathered behind them, and perhaps the future of the mark itself. By the final hours before sunrise, the defenders had fallen back toward the Hornburg. The ancient fortress still stood, but only barely. The enemy seemed everywhere. The night had become a test not simply of strength, but of endurance. And as the eastern horizon slowly prepared to receive the first pale light of morning, Theoden faced a decision that would define his legacy forever. Instead of waiting behind his remaining defenses for the end, the King of Rohan chose to ride out and meet it head-on. Why did Theoden choose to charge out of the Hornburg at dawn, when every visible sign suggested that the battle had already been lost? By the final hours of the siege, the situation appeared grim. The deeping wall had been breached. Enemy forces occupied much of the valley floor. The defenders had withdrawn toward the Hornburg itself. Thousands of attackers remained between the fortress and any obvious route of escape. Theoden could see the condition of his men. They were exhausted from a night of continuous combat. Yet what happened next reveals something fundamental about both the King of Rohan and Tolkien's understanding of courage. Courage, in Tolkien's world, is rarely confidence in victory. Again and again, his heroes act when success appears uncertain. Fingolfin rode alone against Morgoth, despite impossible odds. The Fellowship left Rivendell without any guarantee of survival. Frodo continued toward Mordor long after hope seemed unreasonable. Theoden now faced a similar moment. He could remain behind the remaining defenses and wait for the final assault. Or he could seize the initiative, however briefly, and ride out as a king of the Mark. The decision carried practical value as well. Defenders trapped inside shrinking positions eventually lose the ability to influence events. By attacking suddenly, Theoden could disrupt enemy formations and create confusion. The charge would not magically erase Saruman's numerical superiority, but it could regain momentum. It could remind both friend and foe that the Rohirrim remained capable of striking. Military history often turns on moments when exhausted armies choose action instead of passivity. Aragorn stood beside him. The partnership between the two men had deepened during the preceding days. Theoden represented the ancient kingship of Rohan. Aragorn represented the returning kingship of Gondor. Both carried burdens inherited from generations before them. Both understood that leadership sometimes requires embracing danger openly. When dawn approached, neither intended to hide behind stone walls, while others fought in their place. Then came one of the most memorable images in the Two Towers. The gates of the Hornburg opened. Theoden rode forth with his household warriors. Aragorn accompanied him. Their charge descended into enemy ranks beneath the first light of morning. Tolkien's description emphasizes the sudden transformation of mood. Throughout the night, darkness and pressure had dominated the battle. Now movement, light, and defiance burst outward from the fortress itself. The defenders ceased reacting to events and began shaping them again. Yet the charge alone did not win the battle. This is where Gandalf's earlier promise becomes crucial. Before leaving Theoden, the wizard had instructed him to look toward a particular place at dawn. Throughout the night, that promise remained only a memory. No one within Helm's Deep knew where Gandalf had gone or what he was attempting to accomplish. For all they knew, he might have failed entirely. Nevertheless, the king remembered the words. When the eastern sky began to brighten, attention naturally turned toward the horizon. And there, at the moment of greatest need, Gandalf returned. The wizard appeared upon a ridge overlooking the battlefield. He was no longer Gandalf the Grey. Following his struggle with the Balrog beneath Moria and his return from death, he now bore the authority and presence of Gandalf the White. Beside him rode reinforcements, gathered from the surviving strength of Western Rohan. In The Lord of the Rings, these forces are led primarily by Erkenbrand of the Westfold, one of Rohan's most capable commanders. Erkenbrand is sometimes overshadowed in popular retellings because Peter Jackson's adaptation transfers much of his role to Éomer. The films create a dramatic arrival by having Éomer ride with Gandalf at dawn. Tolkien's book follows a different path. Éomer remains important, but it is Erkenbrand who brings the decisive reinforcement to Helm's Deep. This distinction reflects the broader military structure of Rohan, where experienced regional leaders played critical roles alongside members of the royal family. The appearance of fresh cavalry transformed the battle immediately. Saruman's army suddenly faced threats from multiple directions. Theoden's charge struck from within the fortress. Gandalf and Erkenbrand advanced from outside. Coordination began to break down among the attackers. What had looked like an inevitable victory started becoming a trap. The same geography that had once favored the besieging force now worked against it. There is a subtle detail in Tolkien's narrative that deserves attention. The returning sunlight itself seems to matter. Light often carries symbolic weight throughout the legendarium. The two trees illuminated Valinor before the creation of the sun and moon. Arundel's star becomes a beacon against despair. Galadriel's phial preserves the light of Arundel. At Helm's Deep, dawn arrives at the precise moment when hope appears lost. Tolkien does not treat this as mere coincidence. He repeatedly associates evil with domination, concealment, and darkness, while renewal often arrives with light. The psychological effect upon Saruman's troops must have been profound. Many of them had fought through a difficult night. They expected victory. Instead, they suddenly found defenders charging toward them and fresh enemies appearing behind them. Confidence can vanish quickly on a battlefield. Once soldiers begin to believe that events are moving against them, momentum becomes difficult to recover. Saruman's army, which had seemed unstoppable only hours earlier, began losing cohesion. Yet another mystery remains. If Gandalf and Erkenbrand had arrived even an hour later, would Helm's Deep have fallen? The question cannot be answered with certainty. The defenders were under immense pressure. Their positions had narrowed significantly. Casualties had accumulated throughout the night. Another prolonged assault might have overwhelmed the remaining resistance. Tolkien leaves the timing exact enough to feel dramatic, yet realistic. The victory comes neither too early nor too comfortably. It arrives at the edge of disaster. As the attackers retreated, many fled away from the Hornburg and toward what seemed their safest avenue of escape. The valley behind them appeared open. The mountains stood silent. The immediate threat seemed to come from cavalry and defenders, not from the landscape itself. Driven by fear and confusion, thousands sought survival in the only direction that appeared available. What they did not realize was that the battlefield had changed in a way none of them expected. During the night, while men fought upon walls and causeways, another force had been moving through the world beyond ordinary human understanding. It was older than kingdoms, older than Rohan, older even than the fortress of Helm Hammerhand. And by dawn, that force was waiting for the fleeing army at the edge of a strange and silent forest. What happened to the thousands of survivors from Saruman's army after the battle? And why do Tolkien's descriptions of their fate feel stranger than almost anything else in the story of Helm's Deep? When the tide of battle turned against Isengard, retreat became inevitable. Uruk-hai, who had spent the night attacking the Deeping Wall, now found themselves pursued. Dunlendings abandoned positions and sought escape. Orcs scattered wherever they could. The organized assault that had threatened to destroy Rohan dissolved into confusion. Yet the fleeing army soon encountered something unexpected. A forest stood where no forest should have been. This detail often surprises readers encountering the book for the first time. At the conclusion of the battle, a great wood appears in the valley beyond Helm's Deep. The trees were not present before the siege began. They arrived during the night. Tolkien identifies them as Hurns, mysterious beings closely connected to the Ents of Fangorn Forest. Their sudden appearance transforms the ending of the battle from a straightforward military victory into something far older and stranger. To understand the Huorns, you must briefly look away from Helm's Deep and toward events unfolding elsewhere in Rohan. While Theoden defended the Hornburg, Merry and Pippin had been carried into Fangorn Forest after escaping the Uruk-hai, who captured them near Amon Hen. There, they encountered Treebeard, known in Sindarin as Fangorn. Treebeard was one of the oldest living creatures in Middle-earth. He remembered ages so distant that most of their events had become legend. Through him, the hobbits learned that Saruman's destruction of forests had awakened a deep anger among the Ents. The Entmoot followed. This gathering of Ents remains one of the most unusual councils in Tolkien's works. Deliberation proceeded slowly, as was the Entish way. Matters of importance deserved careful thought. Yet eventually, a decision emerged. Saruman had crossed a boundary that could no longer be ignored. Trees had been felled. Forests had been burned. Isengard had become a center of destruction. The Ents would go to war. The assault upon Isengard occurred at almost the same time as the Battle of Helm's Deep. While Theoden fought for survival in the Deeping Coombe, Treebeard and the Ents descended upon Saruman's fortress. They shattered walls. They flooded the ring of Isengard by redirecting waters. They trapped Saruman within Orthanc itself. One of the great ironies of the War of the Ring is that Saruman, who spent years preparing armies and engines of war, lost his own stronghold to opponents he barely considered a threat. Yet the Huorns remain distinct from the Ents. Tolkien deliberately leaves aspects of their nature mysterious. Treebeard describes them as beings who have become increasingly tree-like over long ages. Whether they are trees that grew more awake or Ents who grew more tree-like remains uncertain. Even Treebeard speaks of them with caution. They inhabit a region between categories. They are neither ordinary trees nor fully Entish in the way Treebeard is. Their silence only deepens the mystery. This uncertainty has generated discussion among readers for decades. Some interpret the Huorns as representing the oldest memory of the forests themselves. Others see them as evidence that the line between living creatures and living landscapes is less rigid in Middle-earth than modern minds assume. Tolkien never provides a definitive explanation. Instead, he preserves the ambiguity. The result is one of the most effective examples of mystery in the legendarium. Not everything receives a complete answer. When Saruman's fleeing soldiers reached the strange forest, they entered it seeking safety. Few emerged. Tolkien's account is intentionally restrained. He does not describe detailed scenes of slaughter. Instead, he presents reports from survivors and observations made afterward. Bodies were found. Weapons remained scattered among the trees. Large portions of the defeated army simply vanished. The implication is unmistakable. The Huorns dealt with those who entered their domain, yet the exact manner in which they did so remains largely concealed. The restraint makes the episode more unsettling. A fully detailed explanation would reduce the mystery. Tolkien understood this instinctively. By refusing to describe every event, he allows the imagination to occupy the shadows. The Huorns become memorable precisely because they remain partly unknowable. They belong to the same category of mystery that includes the nameless things beneath Moria or certain aspects of Tom Bombadil. The world feels larger because some corners of it resist complete explanation. The reaction of the Dunlendings after the battle provides another revealing detail. Unlike many of the orcs, large numbers of Dunlendings survived. Theoden did not order their extermination. Instead, after they surrendered, he allowed them to depart peacefully once they laid down their weapons. The king even spoke to them regarding the falsehoods Saruman had used to manipulate them. This moment often receives less attention than the battle itself, yet it reveals much about Theoden's character. Victory did not transform him into a tyrant. Throughout Tolkien's writings, good rulers understand the difference between enemies and those who have been deceived. The Dunlendings had fought against Rohan, certainly, yet many had been driven by inherited grievances and Saruman's promises. Theoden recognized this reality. Mercy followed victory. The same principle appears repeatedly elsewhere in the legendarium, from Aragorn's treatment of former enemies to Frodo's pity toward Gollum. And still another question emerges from the aftermath. Was the destruction of Saruman's army at Helm's Deep actually more important than the battle itself? The answer becomes clearer when you examine what remained of Saruman's military strength afterward. His field army was shattered. Thousands of soldiers had been killed, captured, or scattered. Isengard itself had fallen to the Ents. Orthanc remained standing, but its master was trapped inside. The military machine that had taken years to construct ceased functioning effectively in a matter of days. This outcome changed the entire strategic picture of the War of the Ring. Had Saruman succeeded, he might have dominated Rohan and threatened Gondor from the west. He could have coordinated indirectly with Sauron's campaigns. Even without a formal alliance of equals, simultaneous pressure from Mordor and Isengard would have created enormous difficulties for the Free Peoples. Instead, Saruman was removed from the war before its final and most decisive stages. The victory at Helm's Deep therefore extended far beyond a single fortress. A kingdom survived. An invading army was destroyed. A dangerous rival to Sauron was neutralized. Ancient alliances gained another chance to endure. Yet the full importance of the battle would not become visible until days later, when riders gathered once more beneath the banners of Rohan and prepared to answer a desperate call from the south. For even as the dead were counted and the wounded tended within the Hornburg, another crisis was already unfolding. Far away beyond the White Mountains, the great city of Minas Tirith stood under gathering threat. And the men who survived Helm's Deep would soon discover that their hardest ride still lay ahead of them. Was Helm's Deep merely one important victory among many during the War of the Ring? Or was it the battle that made every later victory possible? The question becomes more compelling the longer you examine the events that followed. At first glance, the Battle of the Pelennor Fields appears larger. The armies were greater. The stakes involved Minas Tirith itself, the greatest city of men remaining in the west. The Witch King of Angmar took the field. The fate of Gondor hung in the balance. Yet battles do not exist in isolation. Each emerges from choices and outcomes that came before. Without Helm's Deep, the story leading to Pelennor Fields would look very different. When the fighting ended at the Hornburg, Rohan remained alive as a kingdom. That fact alone was enormously significant. Theoden still ruled. His army still existed. The chain of command remained intact. Refugees had survived. Military organization had survived. Most importantly, the spirit of the kingdom had survived. Saruman's strategy depended upon breaking all of these things. He failed. Instead of collapsing, Rohan emerged from the crisis with renewed confidence and purpose. The timing proved crucial. The siege ended on March 4th, 3019. Only a short time later, events accelerated dramatically across Middle-earth. Gandalf learned through the Palantir of Orthanc that Sauron would soon launch a major assault against Gondor. Messages began moving between allies. Decisions that might once have taken weeks now had to be made within days. The War of the Ring had entered its final phase. One of the most important moments came at Dunharrow. After the victory at Helm's Deep and the confrontation with Saruman at Isengard, Theoden gathered his forces again. Riders assembled beneath the shadow of the White Mountains. Messengers traveled across the Mark carrying summons. The king prepared to honor an oath that stretched back nearly 500 years. Since the days of Sirion and Url, Gondor and Rohan had stood bound by alliance. Now, Gondor needed help more desperately than ever. The Red Arrow arrived. This ancient token, sent from Gondor to Rohan, represented a formal request for aid. Tolkien treats the moment with great dignity because it connects the present crisis to centuries of shared history. The alliance between the two kingdoms was not a matter of convenience. It was a solemn commitment inherited from earlier generations. Theoden did not hesitate. Despite recent losses, Despite exhaustion, despite the dangers ahead, he answered the call. And here, the true significance of Helm's Deep becomes visible. Had Saruman won, no army of Rohan would have ridden east. Theoden might have been dead. The kingdom might have been occupied. Communications with Gondor could have been severed. Sauron's great assault would then have faced one fewer major obstacle. Minas Tirith would have stood alone against the largest military force assembled by Mordor in centuries. Instead, thousands of Rohirrim rode toward Gondor. Their journey became one of the great marches of the Third Age. Riders crossed the landscape under secrecy and urgency. They moved through Anorion. They followed hidden routes when necessary. Ahead of them lay the siege of Minas Tirith. Ahead of them waited the Pelennor fields. The courage displayed at Helm's Deep had not exhausted itself. It continued moving forward toward another battlefield. The death of Theoden at Pelennor fields sometimes overshadows the achievement of his final weeks. Yet when viewed as a complete story, his arc becomes remarkable. At the beginning of the Two Towers, he appears diminished by grief, manipulation, and uncertainty. By the end of the Return of the King, he has become once more the king his people needed. He leads at Helm's Deep. He honors the alliance with Gondor. He rides at the head of the Rohirrim during one of the most famous cavalry charges in fantasy literature. His journey forms one of the most moving restorations in Tolkien's work. Helm's Deep also shaped the future reign of Éomer. Following Theoden's death, Éomer became king of Rohan. He inherited a kingdom that had survived its darkest test. The victories at Helm's Deep and Pelennor fields formed part of the foundation upon which his reign would stand. Under Éomer, the mark remained strong. The alliance with Gondor continued through the Fourth Age. What happened in the Deeping Coombe therefore influenced not merely a battle, but generations of history. Another legacy emerged through Gimli, son of Glóin. During his time at Helm's Deep, Gimli discovered the glittering caves of Aglarond. His descriptions of them enchanted even Legolas, despite the elf's preference for forests. After the War of the Ring, Gimli established a dwarf settlement there. Craftsmen came to dwell within the caverns. Stone halls were expanded. Beauty hidden for ages beneath the mountains entered a new chapter of life. It is one of Tolkien's quieter reminders that war sometimes reveals treasures as well as dangers. The relationship between Gimli and Legolas deepened further because of events surrounding Helm's Deep. Their friendship had already begun during the Fellowship's journey, but the shared trials of battle strengthened it. Later, they would travel together through Fangorn Forest and eventually journey together into the West. In a world marked by ancient divisions, their companionship became a symbol of reconciliation. The siege therefore left its mark not only on kingdoms, but on individual lives. There is a tendency, when studying battles, to focus entirely on strategy and outcomes. Those elements matter. Yet Tolkien consistently directs attention towards something deeper. The Battle of the Hornburg was not won solely because walls were strong or because reinforcements arrived at the right moment. It was won because individuals refused to surrender to despair. Theoden chose action over resignation. Aragorn continued fighting despite impossible odds. Ordinary men held positions long after fear told them to flee. Hope remained alive long enough for dawn to arrive. And perhaps that is why Helm's Deep occupies such a distinctive place in Tolkien's legendarium. It combines history and legend in equal measure. The fortress carries memories of Helm Hammerhand and the Long Winter. The battle itself belongs firmly to the War of the Ring. Ancient stone meets immediate danger. Old stories suddenly become relevant again. The past reaches forward and helps preserve the future. Few locations in Middle-earth embody that continuity so completely. Long after the armies departed and the wounds of war began to heal, the Hornburg remained where it had always stood. The deeping wall still stretched across the valley. The White Mountains still rose above the deeping Coombe. Winds still moved through the passes. Travelers who arrived generations later could look upon the fortress and remember the night when Rohan stood at the edge of destruction and endured. And if you return in your thoughts to that opening image, the cold air, the torchlight trembling against ancient stone, the stars shining above the dark valley, you find that the fortress is quiet once more. The armies are gone. The drums have fallen silent. Yet the walls remain, watching beneath the same heavens they watched before Helm Hammerhand, before Theoden, and before the Great War itself, holding their memories in stone, while the mountain wind drifts softly through the deep. When you look back across the whole story of Helm's Deep, what stands out is not merely a battle, nor even a victory. It is the strange way Tolkien's world allows old things to matter. A forgotten fortress built by Gondor centuries earlier becomes the shield of another kingdom. The memory of Helm Hammerhand reaches across generations to strengthen Theoden in his own hour of need. Ancient oaths between Gondor and Rohan still carry weight when the men who first swore them have long since turned to dust. In Middle-earth, history is never dead. The past remains alive beneath the present, like deep roots hidden beneath a hillside, feeding the living long after the hands that planted them are gone. There is also a quiet warning running through every stage of the tale. Saruman falls for the same reason that so many powerful figures fall throughout the legendarium. He begins by desiring wisdom and ends by desiring control. He studies evil believing himself strong enough to master it. Yet Tolkien repeatedly suggests that domination is not simply a tool that can be picked up and set aside. It changes the hand that grasps it. Saruman gains armies, engines, spies, and fortresses. But in pursuing power, he loses the very qualities that once made him worthy of trust. The wizard who might have become one of Middle-earth's greatest defenders becomes instead a lesser shadow of the enemy he hoped to rival. Against that ambition stands something far humbler. The defenders of Helm's Deep do not possess overwhelming strength. Many are old men. Some are scarcely trained for war. Their king has only recently emerged from despair. Their allies are few. Yet Tolkien returns again and again to the idea that hope is not a prediction of success. Hope is the decision to continue when success cannot be guaranteed. Theoden rides because it is right to ride. Aragorn stands because it is right to stand. The men upon the wall endure because there is nothing else worthy of them. The victory comes later. The choice comes first. You can see the same pattern in the mercy shown after the battle. Theoden does not answer cruelty with cruelty. The Dunlendings are allowed to depart. The defeated are not hunted without restraint. Even in war, Tolkien refuses to make goodness identical with triumph. The heroes are not defined by the enemies they destroy, but by the principles they preserve while fighting them. This is one reason his world continues to feel different from so much modern fantasy. The greatest victories are moral before they are military. And perhaps that is why Helm's Deep feels larger than the fortress itself. It is not really a story about stone walls. It is a story about endurance. The wall breaks, yet the defenders endure. The night deepens, yet they endure. The enemy surrounds them, yet they endure. Throughout Tolkien's work, evil often appears stronger in the moment. Its armies are larger, its weapons are more terrible, its victories seem more immediate, yet it cannot create anything lasting. It can only consume. The things that survive are loyalty, friendship, memory, courage, and the willingness to stand together against darkness for one more hour. So, as the story settles into silence, you find yourself once more beneath the White Mountains. The battle is over now. The banners have been lowered. The voices of kings and warriors have faded into history. A cool wind moves along the ancient stones of the Hornburg, just as it did before the siege, and just as it will long afterward. Above the valley, the stars shine quietly over the deeping coombe, and the old fortress keeps its watch beneath the night.